Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. Today, I welcome Riley Protz, a pharmacist who has been on the FIRE journey since completing his pharmacy administration residency training. In this episode, we'll delve into Riley's career journey, his student loan philosophy and repayment strategy, and his pathway towards achieving financial independence. We'll also discuss the challenges of pursuing FIRE and how Riley balances his desire for financial independence with living a rich and fulfilling life today. If you're new to the concept of FIRE, Riley will explain what it means and why he has chosen to pursue it. We'll also hear from Riley about the resources that have been most helpful for him on his journey, including books, websites, and podcasts. So whether you're on the FIRE journey or taking a long, steady approach saving for retirement, at YFP Planning, we're here to support you along the way. YFP Planning is a fee-only financial planning firm that is customized to the pharmacy professional. The team at YFP Planning includes 5 certified financial planners serving over 280 households in 40-plus states. If you're interested in learning more about working one-on-one with a certified financial planner may help you achieve your financial goals, you can book a free discovery call by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, let's jump into my interview with Riley Protz. Riley, thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, hey Tim, thanks for having me.
So before we jump into your FIRE journey, which is going to be the topic at hand for today, tell us about your career journey in pharmacy, where you went to pharmacy school, and what ultimately drew you into the profession.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I honestly wish I had a better why pharmacy story, but I went to Oregon State University for undergrad, enjoyed the science classes. And so when it was time to choose a major, I had a friend that was doing pre-pharmacy, and I thought, hey, Oregon State has an advanced degree program. Maybe I'll go and do an advanced degree. That kind of makes sense. So I chose pre-pharmacy as a major and thought, what, something will come up that I want to do more, something more compelling. And nothing really ever, piqued my interest more than pharmacy did. I liked, those pre-pharmacy classes I took. I got into pharmacy school on the first try at Oregon State University, so it was a very easy transition. And I kind of stuck with it ever since. So I didn't really have any experience, prior to choosing pharmacy, and kind of, navigated those waters as I got into school. And it's luckily worked because I kind of didn't have a great plan going into the process.
You and me both, Riley. I think sometimes, we have people on the show that have very motivational, very inspiring stories around how they entered the profession. And, I've shared before on the show that I liked science, I liked math. I was undecided from a major standpoint. I had a guidance counselor that said, hey, why not think about pharmacy? I did one shadowing experience. I think it was an independent pharmacy, and made a commitment for 6 years and a whole lot of money from that advice. So, sometimes that's how the story goes. But you decided, Riley, hey, I'm going to get the PharmD, but I'm going to go as well and do a PGY1, PGY2 MBA combined program. And for many of our listeners, they may be familiar with these as a PGY1, PGY2 MS. Some do an MBA program where you're doing all of that in a 2-year period. Why did you choose that pathway? And then what is the work that you've been doing since completing that?
Yeah, I chose to do, around P3 year, I had an internship in community pharmacy. I'd worked in hospital pharmacy a little bit, and I kind of decided that I wanted to do something around leadership and administration. And then the career, trajectory and, platform, there's a lot less opportunities in community pharmacy than there is in health systems and hospitals, right? There's just a lot more opportunities to be a manager, director, whatever it may be in the administration realm. And so when I kind of looked, okay, I have to go towards hospital, a residency just made sense. And if I wanted to fast forward that pathway, the dual, PGY1, PGY2, it's HSPAL now, which is too many letters, but Health System Pharmacy Administration and Leadership Residency seemed like the correct option for me. So I was very fortunate to match with that. And I had a dual MBA, tacked on to the residency. So I completed the MBA in the middle of residency. And, ideally, you're supposed to have a lot of good opportunities, completion of residency, especially doing an administration residency, getting that additional MBA. I graduated in the summer of 2020, very early on in the pandemic when everyone's pulling back. There were almost zero job opportunities.
Yeah.
But I had a great mentor who had left the organization I was at for residency, became a chief pharmacy officer somewhere else, and was able to create a position that I was lucky to have. And so I was a pharmacy manager for a couple of years at a health system, focusing on their 340B program as well as their hospital purchasing. And then last year, I've switched to the consulting realm, which has been super exciting. Still around 340B, so I kind of consider myself a subject matter expert around optimizing 340 programs for clinics and hospitals. And so the company is called Spend Pharmacy, and so my clients now are hospitals, and we help them, around finding more savings and helping with their hospital purchasing in general. So NDC optimization, really anywhere around decreasing their huge drug expense in the hospital, because that's usually one of your top 3 expenses for a health system.
Riley, let's talk about your student loans before we jump into the fire journey in more detail. And since 2018, so you graduated 2018, $80,000 when you came out, and for those that have graduated since 2018, it's really been a whirlwind, right? We've had the pandemic pause that's now been going on for more than 3 years. We've had the expansion of PSLF eligibility. We've talked about that on the show. And then right now, this week, at the time of recording, the Supreme Court is deciding what they're going to do related to the Biden administration debt cancellation program. Not looking too favorable in the moment for that program going through, but we'll obviously provide updates as we get some final news there. So my question is $80,000, that is substantially less than what we see as the national average today for pharmacy grads, right around 160. What was your philosophy and strategy related to your student loans, especially knowing some of the wrinkles that have come in over the last couple of years with the pandemic and with some of the PSLF extensions and waivers?
Yeah, sure. So I was lucky to have graduated with $80,000. I went to in-state tuition. I lived at home for 2 of the 4 years of pharmacy school, worked, every summer. And so I think that helped with getting that number low at the very end. But once I graduated pharmacy school, I was like, okay, well, there's a lot of decisions to make, right? Do you want to go through income-based repayment? There's repay, there's PSLF, which, in 2018, people were less, likely to see that it would go through. But now, it looks like it's a great strategy. There's refinancing your loans as well. And so I think I probably pulled up multiple calculators, maybe the YFP calculator on your guys' website, and said, hey, what makes sense with my, 5.5% interest rate to do. And financially, it made sense to pay it off sooner rather than later and not to go through the income-based repayment method. And so that's what I started doing. I was paying off my loans throughout residency. I was about to refinance my loans when I completed residency when the pause took place. So I was like, hey, 0% interest rate's a lot better than, what I could have gotten, maybe 3.5%. And so I just took it as an opportunity to pay them off as fast as I could. And so my strategy completing residency was live like I'm still a resident, right? That's what we tell people, don't let lifestyle creep come into play. And so I just paid those off as quickly as I could. I did end up stopping a little bit and saying, let's just hold on to the money. And I don't really need to pay it off, right? There's 0% interest. And so once I think I had around, maybe $35,000 left, I did refinance it just to get that cash bonus, and then paid it off. And I didn't told you this last time we chatted, Tim. I had tried to do the student loan, forgiveness, get a refund back, not student loan forgiveness.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was back in October. I tried to get the $10,000 refund back because my loans are at 0% now, but I would have qualified for the student loan forgiveness because my income in 2020, I was a resident for half of this. I didn't reach that income limit. And literally yesterday, I got the check in the mail from of that $10,000. So you know what? Who knows if it's actually ever going to come into play? But now I have a student loan balance of $10,000, which if forgiveness happens, that's great. And if not, I take a 0% free interest loan and I'll put that in my high yield savings account for a little bit of time. So literally, I didn't even think it was going to come. It was a request I put in, and 4 to 5 months later, literally yesterday, the check came.
I say, what timing, right? With us recording the episode here today. Yeah, and I think your stories are a really good one. One of the things I'm sensing, which I love, Riley, and I hope other listeners will take from it, is just the intentionality around understanding the nuances of student loans, right? There's lots of different pathways to go. You mentioned some of those, whether it's forgiveness, non-forgiveness, refinancing. It's more complicated of a system than it probably needs to be, but that's the hand we've been dealt, whether we like it or not. And it's really up to the borrower to take the time to understand the nuances and really get into the optimization, which is what you're doing, right? You're putting yourself in a position to optimize. We'll obviously see what comes to be of the Supreme Court decision when payments are going to kick back in. But I love the intentionality behind the strategy. And I'm sensing that's going to be a good segue here as we talk about fire, because that also, relies on a strategy of one being intentional. So let's go there. And Riley, when you and I talked last year, what really excited me was talking to a new practitioner who is really on the front end of their journey towards financial independence. And I think sometimes as new practitioners, I just talked with a new practitioner this week who's been out about 7-8 years, and they've been working through student loans. They got married, they started a family, and that concept of retirement planning, it's like, yeah, it'll be there, something I'll worry about a little bit later. And I think for some folks that are planning a very traditional timeline to retirement, that pathway of savings may certainly work. Obviously, as we'll talk here today, a more aggressive early investing in your career type of a strategy. But I think for many new practitioners, it's hard to reconcile this idea that I can accelerate and optimize the wealth building part of my financial plan while I'm being saddled by, student loan debt, getting started with my career, and all these other competing priorities. So I'm really excited to dive in with you as you're on the front end of the journey of the fire. Why did you go this pathway? How are you employing strategies on the fire journey? And what are some of the resources that have helped you along the way? Before we get too deep, though, for folks that have not heard us talk about fire on this show before, and we'll link to some of those episodes in the show notes as well. What is fire? From your perspective, what does it stand for? What does it mean? And what's the purpose? What's the goal?
Yeah, I don't think there's a true definition of fire. So I think it's whatever individual to each person, what they think it means. I think of it as maybe a money philosophy or a life strategy. So it stands for financial independence, retire early. So at the heart of it, I really think it's if you hit a point, so there's really a threshold where your passive income supersedes your living expenses. And passive income can include a lot of different things. Traditionally people are thinking their retirement accounts, right? Their 401ks, but you've got potentially rental income. You have Social Security. You have maybe a side hustle, and I'd even put in PRN and part time work is that's definitely more passive than thinking about your classic W-2 job. So if you hit a point where, let's say, it costs you $40,000 to live each year, and you have a point where your investments and all of your other passive income supersedes that number, then you really don't have to work at your job anymore. So that's where that second half of retire early comes into play.
So let's give an example, Riley, and I'd love for you to chime in here about what you do and don't like about this example. But to your point, there's no uniform accepted definition of what it means to be financially independent. But as you're alluding to, you get to this point of either assets diversifying your income, other sources of income, such that you really reach financial independence, meaning that you no longer rely on your W-2 income, but you can build essentially a retirement paycheck or an early retirement paycheck, however you define that, based on these other revenue streams or savings that you've built up. So, the rule of 25 suggests that, hey, if you take your annual household expenses, we can talk about whether or not you include, taxes in that, you multiply by 25. Once you get to that point in terms of savings, you're able to get to that point of financial independence. So if our annual expenses are $100,000, multiply that by 25, $2.5 million. And really this comes from the research on the 4% rule, which $2.5 million, if I safely withdraw, we can debate that 4%, I can replace that $100,000 and that becomes the source. Now, you start to get a little bit more wrinkles in that when you talk about, okay, is it coming from only your savings? Is it coming from rental income? Is it coming from Social Security? But without getting too far in the details there, what do you and don't you like about kind of that back of napkin math?
Yeah, I think, if someone's going to Google, fire financial independence today, at least in the first 3 paragraphs, they're going to mention Rule of 25 or 4% rule because it's simple. It makes sense. First things people are like, well, I don't know if that's true. If I trust it, it almost seems too simple, right? But the numbers don't lie is a great point to make that it truly we've seen people do it. It does work, but as you mentioned, I'm sure a lot of listeners have yearly expenses around $100,000. They plug that Rule of 25 in. They say, there's no way I'll ever get to $2.5 million, right? They immediately dismiss the idea and say, there's just no possible chance that I'm ever going to hit that point. And so they think, forget about it. I'm going to retire when I'm 65 years old. And so that's my real hiccup with the 4% rule is I think it dissuades people who might be interested in the idea. And of course, I'm not trying to push this idea on folks, but I think it quickly dissuades people because they think there's no way that's ever going to occur for them. But this rule puts a lot of assumptions in place. Like number one is they assume that you'll never make another dollar again, which, let's say you're retiring, 10, 15, 20 years early, the odds of you never making another dollar is probably pretty, I don't think that's going to happen. They assume that your nest egg or your 401k, your Roth, everything that makes that $2.5 million is all you have. But right, you could have a side gig, a side hustle. Let's say you're like, for example, your expenses are $100,000 per year, but you're still making, like you're working a little bit. You've got a side hustle
Yeah.
going on. You're doing maybe PRN work. That's a benefit of being a pharmacist. Is we can work one day a week, right? That's a
Mhm.
great aspect of our job. And you're making $40,000 per year, much less than the average pharmacist makes. But then that decreases your yearly expenses to 60K. And so
Yeah.
your actual rule of 25 number becomes 1.5 million. It's a much
Mhm.
more, easily ingestible number to take. Another assumption, your expenses are going to remain constant throughout your entire life, but data shows that the older you get, especially your 70s and 80s, you're not going to be spending as much as you are in your
Mhm.
40s, 50s, and 60s. And so you take that in consideration as well. And then I think my last one is, compound interest is just really hard to visualize in like the amount of time and how it actually works. And so if you're telling somebody, hey, really you should save that extra $2,000 because it's going to grow to, whatever it may be in 20 years, they're like, I don't know if that's actually going to work. I can't see it, but I can see a TV today, or I can see, a new car today, and I can get those benefits now. And so I think it's a great initial, just quick back of the napkin math on how this works. But I think too many people are dissuaded and say, oh, there's no way I'm going to get there. And so a lot of those factors I just described, all of them would lead to a lower number, and potentially,
Yeah.
if you can shave off 5 years of retirement, that's great as well, right? Because you can enjoy those years while
Yeah.
you can.
And I think that's such a great point, Riley, because right, you've highlighted well already that everyone's plan is going to be different. And I think that's where, we need to make sure we're not falling into the trap of that there's one way to do fire, right? Are we talking about a retirement age of 40 or, 55 or just a little bit earlier, late 50s or 60? So is it more of an aggressive timeline or just, a little bit earlier than more of a traditional retirement? Might there be some side additional income? Are we interested in looking at real estate investment, obviously post retirement? What about Social Security? What about, health risks and health costs? I mean, there's so many layers to consider. But your point of the rule of 25, I think often being overwhelming, especially to folks earlier in their journey, is a really good one. I can tell you the number of sessions or presentations I've done with folks where when you talk about saving or investing for the future and compound interest, eyes gloss over, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, big numbers, 3, 4, $5 million. And one of the things we really try to do, at YFP is how do we discount that back to today to make that a meaningful number, right? So we can run an estate calculation and show that fire or not, you need 3 point whatever $1 million. Okay, that's scary. That's overwhelming. I'm more depressed now about achieving a long-term financial independence. But what does that mean today in terms of how much I need to be able to save and what assumptions go into place? And that number is probably still going to be big, maybe bigger than we want in terms of, maybe it's going to take 800, 1200, 1500, 1800 a month, whatever. But we can start to put our arms around that, right? I think these big, huge numbers are like, all right, might as well just give up. I'm early in the journey. I'm just going to kind of focus on the here and now. So, point well taken. I think that can be a challenge. So, Riley, let's take a step back to your fire journey. What was the motivating factor or factors in terms of, why you wanted to go down this pathway?
Yeah, I think I reflected on this a little bit recently on, why I was so hooked on it when I first found fire. And I think my reasoning has actually changed in the short years since I found it. But I'll take you back to, let's see, I think it's 2019 now, when I was a
Mhm.
PGY1. We have a big cohort of co-residents. There were 16 of us. I think we were talking about what to do with our 403Bs. And as you can probably tell, I have a passion for personal finance. And so I knew a little bit more than everyone else and was trying to, provide a little bit of guidance, but didn't feel super confident, right? Especially talking about that topic.
Mhm.
And in residency, we spend so much time talking about certain disease states, and we had antimicrobial stewardship conferences and ethics conferences and professionalism. We didn't spend a single second on personal finance. I remember going to my RPD and asking, "Hey, like, can we have someone come in and just talk to us for an hour or two?" There really wasn't an option for doing that, so I thought, why don't I do it? And it was during that, I was trying to treat it like a topic discussion, and trying to find empirical and objective data, which, as I'm sure is very hard to find on the internet, but I did stumble upon the concept of fire, and was immediately hooked. I think I'm in the midst of PGY1. I probably should have been spending a lot more time on residency and MBA classes, but all I want to do is read about this concept. I'm like, it doesn't make sense. Like, there's no way it's actually real. Does the numbers line up? And there's a lot of blogs online that I just kind of just took up as much as I could. And I think there were two main reasons why they were motivating factors for me to pursue. And number one being, I've always been a natural saver, but I didn't really have a reason for why I was saving. Even ever since I was a child, like, I fill the piggy bank up when I got money for my birthday, but I didn't know what I was doing. I felt like, I'll just save it. And so financial independence kind of became like a North Star. So whenever I'm making a decision, being very intentional with every dollar, like if I'm not going to spend it on one thing, I'm not just saving it. I actually have another reason, I'm putting it towards another purpose, which was a big idea. And then the second reason, which, I think is a big pushback of people who pursue FIRE, is I was, once again, in the midst of PGY1, probably not loving life at the moment. It's not a sustainable way to live and work. And so the idea of, not working, I think I was probably drawn to. And that's what, a big pushback is, that's, you shouldn't be pursuing this idea because you want to escape your job and retire early. But, now I absolutely love what I'm doing. So you'd think that my desire for financial independence would wane, right? But I'm still, I have a different reason, I guess, for pursuing it. And bear with me as I make this point. So I've kind of a strategy now of maximizing overall life happiness and fulfillment and meaning, whatever that may be. So if I'm trying to solve for maximum happiness, then treating bringing that down into like every day, what would that look like in different buckets on things that would make me happy. So that'd be a strong social life. Today, there's spending time with parents and friends, but let's fast forward 15 years because I've got a plan for the future, right? Probably spending time with future children. I don't think I'm going to have 5 boys or 4 boys like you do. And if I do, then that's going to be a higher percentage of my time being spent with children. Sure. So that's one bucket. Second bucket being health. If I work out today, there's benefits, but the main reason I'm working out is for future me, right? I want to have as many healthy days as possible. Maybe 2 more buckets here. One of them being philanthropy, giving back in some way, whether that be resources or money. That's going to skew much more later in life. And the last one here, curiosity or learning. Like I love to, travel internationally, read, whatever it may be. And so let's take my current W-2 job. Let's say that satisfies probably 3 of those 4 buckets. I got a sense of social life, definitely a sense of philanthropy. It's a great thing about being a pharmacist is we have very fulfilling jobs. And then definitely fulfilling that learning bucket. But I spend around 45 hours of my waking life per week on this job. And so it's not filling every single bucket. And there's plenty of other buckets that I'm not going to go into. And so if I'm trying to solve for maximum fulfillment and happiness, I've just got a pretty high degree of confidence that in 15 years or 20 years or 10 years, I'm not going to want to spend 45 hours per week on, this one job. I'm going to have a lot more other pursuits that are going to help me lead, a fulfilling and happy life. So, let's fast forward, let's say 15 years, maybe I want to spend 20 hours per week at my job. Maybe it's 0. If I'm lucky, maybe it's 60. Maybe I absolutely love what I'm doing and that's great. But I want to give myself the ability and flexibility to make that decision when the time comes. And so that's where financial independence comes in. If you save a little bit more now, then that gives you the ability to make that decision down the line.
Riley, that's beautiful. And I'm glad you address this equation of solving for maximum fulfillment, maximum happiness. And actually the research on this topic is fascinating, around deriving happiness from money and how we connect the two. And, I think that it's a natural evolution to be thinking about that, especially when you build a strong financial foundation, right? It's hard to see that when you're in the thick of all these decisions, when you work through the student loans, you're making a good income, you're working full time, you've got a lot of places you can optimize the plan. I think that's when you can really start to, have some of that peace of mind and be worried about things like solving for maximum happiness and fulfillment because you've got a strong foundation of what you're growing from. And I think that too often when we talk about investing or savings goals, we leave out the so what. What's the purpose? What's the point? What's the why? And I think pharmacists, especially very analytical folks, I think we can get all excited sometimes about the spreadsheets and, hey, I'm on path to save $2.4 million. Like, what's the purpose? Like, if we ask that question of what are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we reconcile taking care of our future selves while also living a rich life today? Both are important, right? And I think one of the knocks, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, I think one of the knocks of the FIRE community would be like, typically we're looking at very aggressive saving rates, right? There's all different types of FIRE, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But usually we're defining FIRE and aggressive pursuit of financial independence by fairly high savings rates, more than the typical 10 to 20%. And so one of the knocks may be, well, are you giving up living a rich life today for a future point that may or may not be what we envision that to be, right? And I'm thinking about this because I just finished the book Die with Zero by Bill Perkins, and he talks beautifully in a very non-traditional, non-financial planner way about, ultimately the goal being that we die with zero. And he makes a strong case, I think, that in your 20s and 30s and 40s, there is spending that needs to be done towards what you're talking about, this maximum fulfillment. So how have you reconciled this pull between like aggressive savings? I can punch that in the calculator. I see the compound interest growing, but I'm also at an age where I can and should experience some of these beautiful things in life. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, you beat me to it. I actually also did. I also finished Die with Zero recently within the last couple of months, and that, I'll be honest, has shifted my mentality a little bit. As I
Mm,
was, someone that can delay gratification, right? That was kind of my philosophy. Is, if I want to do something today, let's wait, and I can double it in 10 years, right? I'll have just as
hmm
much benefit or more benefit when I'm saving for my 40s. Is kind of a mentality I'd had. But what Bill Perkins says in the book is a very good idea, and something I've taken into consideration is, let's think about, we think about our life as a whole. And if my goal is to maximize happiness today, but also in the future, there's a balancing act, right? Because you
That's
need to
right.
spend more money today. You need to spend some money today in order to enjoy your life today. And I was, let's say, for last couple of years, I was probably a little low on that rent. I was saving a lot more money and decreasing my expenses, and focusing on student loans and maybe sacrificing a little bit. And so I will shift, and have shifted a little bit in that regard, towards enjoying life today. But I will say, a benefit for myself and maybe other listeners is we have above average income. And so, when you're looking at financial independence and decreasing your expenses and having that difference in what you're able to, save because you're spending less than what you're earning, it's a lot harder for somebody with an income of $60,000 per year. But as a pharmacist, I really don't even feel like we have to sacrifice as
Hmm.
much as others, because we're just, as long as you're intentional with your spending and, cutting out unnecessary things, then, you'll be able to achieve, some sort of savings goal. That's, you're not, depriving yourself and eating rice and beans every day. And so for myself, as I mentioned, being early on, I've been able to, reduce lifestyle creep as much as possible. And so I don't, live a lavish life. As if someone else is, has their expenses $100,000 per year, it's gonna be a lot harder to cut out, let's say, $40,000 out of
Yeah.
that budget, or $20,000. But I never allowed myself to reach that level. And so I've never really felt that I've been, sacrificing anything on this journey.
Let me prod a little bit more here, Riley, because this to me is a fascinating topic where I can talk with two pharmacists making the same exact income. Let's assume they're living in the same cost of living, type of situation, but one can be living 95 to 100% of their income is their expenses, and a lot of that even being, fixed expenses. And someone else maybe has find a way for that to be, I don't know, 25, 35, 45, percent, or even let's say 50 or 60. And I think often what you see is, the home or the car, those are probably two of the biggest things that you see that might be contributing to that. Sometimes it's private education would be a big contributor as well, saving for kids' college, things like that. But two pharmacists, same income, same position in terms of cost of living area, but very different in terms of cash flow margin that they've created. And so I think what would be helpful for our listeners to hear is for you in your situation, as much as you're willing to share, like what has the strategy been? You mentioned before, like continuing to try to live like a resident while you're paying down your student loans. I sense you probably have pulled off of that a little bit, but have you intentionally, kept down on house, or you've decided to continue to rent, not carry car pay? Like what has been the strategy that has allowed you to keep those fixed costs so low?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, financial confidence is important. Knowing,
Mm,
knowing why you're investing something or saving in the correct location. For example, high yield savings account. And keep just making sure that you know what you're doing correctly with where your money is going. Has been important for myself, and I not scared to look at my checking account. Right, I think there's a lot of people who say, I don't want to look
that's
at it.
right.
I think if you can spend a little bit of time to just be confident in what you're doing and have some sort of
Mm,
strategy in place and be intentional with, you don't need to track every single dollar, but just the big things. I think low hanging fruit is what I tell clients. Like, let's not make 100 little decisions. Let's make 2 or 3 big decisions. So for
mm,
myself, yeah, I don't carry a car payment. I did actually upgrade from a beater of a car that probably I did sell for $1,000. So I've upgraded in that realm. But I was, I had drove that car throughout pharmacy school. I do still rent for housing. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and so yeah, housing's a little bit more expensive, but it makes sense financially. I looked into purchasing. I was actually going. I was shout out to the real estate podcast with David and Nate. I was in the first
Yeah.
cohort of the none to one program. I was looking at actually purchasing a condo and house hacking. Didn't make financial sense, and so it made sense for me to continue renting there.
Riley,
Yeah, go
let
ahead.
me just interject here because I hear weekly, if not daily, that Tim, what do you mean like equity and home ownership and like it's always better to own than it is to rent? And I think this is one of the stories that we've just accepted without running the numbers. And don't get me wrong, like there are scenarios where certain parts of the country, owning based on the market, based on what's happening, based on interest rates, based on cash you have, based on appreciation, that make sense. But I think we blindly accept this, especially higher cost of living areas. We tend to vastly underestimate the cost of home ownership on an ongoing basis. And so we look at a rent value, we look at a mortgage payment, and we stop there. And so I would just love for you to help me make this case that sometimes renting makes sense over home ownership. And I think we really got to run the numbers.
The problem is it's the numbers, and humans are humans, right? And so they feel,
That's
you
right.
take into consideration, oh, I'm much more safe, and I've been told by my parents and my parents' parents that buying is, you have to do it as soon as you can. That's the way to go. And once again, it's a lot easier to see a house value go up in 5 to 10 years rather than
Mm,
really knowing exactly how much would I put in if I'd invested it. You can run those numbers as well, right? The numbers, once again, numbers aren't lying to you. But I think it's just tough because that's what we've been told to do.
mhm.
And it doesn't make sense everywhere. And so sometimes that's the caveat as well, is, it does make sense maybe in the Midwest, but
Yeah.
for other folks, it's not the case. And so, yeah, if as long as, if we were all robots, then I think a lot more people would be renting, but that's just unfortunately not the case.
Well, that's good. Now you can get the hate mail as well as me. So it'll be a stream.
Exactly.
Hey, I want to ask you a question. Actually, I hadn't planned on asking you, which is interesting. Something I'm picking up on as we're talking here is I sense that, you've used some words around the emotional side of money, right? Confidence. I can tell you have a confidence around your money. I can tell that there's not a fear associated with the money. You obviously have more of an analytical mindset, but you're also considering, we talked about living a rich life and kind of balancing the two of those out. And so often, myself included, and it's true for everyone listening, how we approach our money today is a conscious or subconscious reflection of how we grew up around money. And, in some cases, we grew up in an environment where it's a very open conversation. It's one that's not only talked about, but it may not be, stressful, relatively even emotions, more of an abundance type of a mindset. Other situation, I talk with folks where it was a very hostile environment or an environment where you just don't talk about money whatsoever. And you see those patterns carry out. And so I would love for you to just give us a sneak peek as I pick up on the themes of confidence and security around money and, more of a positive emotional approach towards money. Can you attribute, did you raise up in an environment where it was a safe emotional landscape for learning about and growing your knowledge around personal finance?
I would say it was definitely a safe environment, but it was not. I did not grow up with parents telling me how much money they made, and
Mm,
oh, you need to. I did. I mean, for example, I chose a state school. I knew enough to know about the cost of private school versus public school, and what that would be down the line. But that
yeah.
wasn't. I wasn't told, hey, it makes a lot more sense for you to make the decision by peers or my parents or anything. So I don't really attribute a lot of it to them being extremely open. But for example, I did have a Roth IRA. I think when I was 18 years old. So my mom helped me with that. So I'll give her credit there.
Speaking like a true
I
nerd.
exactly, and that was all her. So I'll give her all the credit there. But anyway, I also had a financial advisor that she put me in touch with, who had me,
Mm,
investing in, taxable brokerage account when I clearly could have put more money in my Roth, and stuff that didn't make any sense. So I had to pull
mhm.
away once I felt more confident in myself. A few years after that, and so we weren't experts, but I definitely I think it's rare for someone to have a financial advisor and a Roth account in their teens, and so I
Yeah.
will attribute some of it to that. Yeah.
It's something I'm thinking a lot about, Riley, with my 4 boys, and I would encourage, the listeners. I'm fumbling through it. I don't have the answers. I've read books on, teaching kids about money, and I'm convinced, I think, and maybe I'll tell you otherwise in 3 years if I screw it all up, but I'm convinced that 80% of it is just what they are experiencing, they're hearing. It's not the intentional teaching. I think there's a place for that. Like, hey, let me sit down. We can talk about, compound interest and investing in Roth IRAs. But I think it's more of what they're picking up on around the emotional cues, the stress or lack thereof, whether or not it's an open conversation. And I think that is so foundational to their relationship with money. And what's so hard about that, I guess it could be encouraging or discouraging depending on how you approach money, is like, that stuff tends to come out, and we're again carrying that on generationally. And often, the stress or the positive environment, if it's the opposite around money, like that just is the undertone of the house, and you've got to be really intentional to shift it. So another topic for another day, but I think around, emotional relationship, how we grew up with money, even hearing you talk about your mom and a Roth and experience with an advisor clearly had an impact, on you and your journey. Riley, let me shift gears and talk about the types of fire. Again, I think for folks that are just learning about fire for the first time, they may read a few blog articles, look at very aggressive saving rates without realizing there's a wide range of how you may approach this. So, whether it's more of a traditional fire, a lean fire, a fat fire, tell us about these different terms and the path that you are choosing as it relates to your own fire journey.
So in my mind, retirement is a number value, not a date or an age, right? And so, but everybody's going to be different, and your fire calculation takes into consideration mainly how much you're going to spend each year. And so, someone who spends $40,000 in a year versus someone who spends $150,000 in a year is going to lead completely different lifestyles and probably take different actions to hit that point of financial independence throughout their lives. And so that's where these different names come from. Is fires become big enough that there's been sub communities of people. Lean fires, I don't know what the definition is, maybe less than $40,000, and fat fires, people who've got $5+ million. And so I am happy that that makes sense, because people can be like-minded folks can learn from each other in that realm. And I'll be honest with you, I don't really look at consider myself in any of those categories. I'm early enough along the pathway that I don't really spend time stressing over it, because I know enough that I know that things are going to change down the future. We're great at acknowledging how much we've changed in the last 5 years, but we still think we're going to be the same person in the next 5 years, which doesn't make any sense. Like, I know I'm going to be different enough in 10 years that, I'm going to change a little bit enough to know that, my expenses are going to change, my family situation is going to change. But for myself, so I kind of have just, some, general numbers. I'm probably going to spend more than $40,000 in a year, and I know myself well enough that I'm probably going to spend less than, $120,000 per year. So if you do that rule of 25, I've got a pretty big, wide margin, but there's enough time that's going to pass. I think there's really just no point in stressing over it and running the numbers. And some people love running these calculators and saying, "Oh, this is exactly that's my point." That's going to change so many times. There's going to be so many factors that I don't really bother myself with it.
And let's shift and talk more about the strategy of getting to that number. You mentioned early on in the episode that often people run a, rule of 25 or some type of a fire calculator. They see a big number, they get overwhelmed. They shut down the computer and they say, "All right, let's move on." I think even if folks can work through that, the next step can be just as overwhelming, which is, well, how do I get to that number? Right? I mean, when I get the chance to talk with groups about investing, what I often say is, yeah, we've got to know where we're going, but then we've got to know how we're going to get there. And then we've got lots of wrinkles to consider, right? 401k, 403bs, Roth IRAs, brokerage accounts, HSAs, all types of vehicles to achieve that. And then within those accounts, we've got to choose how we're going to allocate that, right? That would be the asset allocation part of the plan. So, again, I eyes gloss over at that point of, wow, this is a lot to consider. And so tell us about, not advice for everyone listening, but tell us about how you approach your investing strategy as it relates to not just identifying that number, but how you're going to get there.
Yeah, Tim, we've used the word optimize quite a bit, but I'm definitely not, I'm not going to optimize as much as possible in this category. I like to keep things pretty simple. So yeah, my strategy myself is, I'm actually currently 100% stocks, all broad-based index funds. Yeah, keep the expense ratio as low as possible. That's every account, all my 401ks or HSAs or my Roth IRA, everything is, the different custodian will have a different, 5-letter or 3-letter process, but as long as it's U.S. stock market or international stock market, that's the process. And I know that numbers wise, if my my investing timeline is, let's say, 50+ years, but the time to actually sell a stock is more than 10 years. And so to me, just the numbers, I just kind of try to pretend I'm a robot and don't look at the stock market, in the last year. But because I know that, odds are it's going to go up in the next 10 years. And you want to hit the point where, let's say, if I'm within 5 years of, cutting back or selling any of stocks, and I'll, switch, add bonds in. You can do a bond tent, whatever it may be. But I keep things pretty simple now, just a handful of different, low cost broad-based index funds. And then the strategy around, what accounts to put them in. Of course, prioritizing your tax advantage accounts. I kind of have a mental, financial order of operations, I guess what I would call it, that I've been using, as I've gone through the process. And for example, student loans is pretty high up on the list, and now I've been able to cut that out. But first and foremost, let's think about this as a emergency fund, and then getting your 401k match, and then I put HSA up there at the top because it's your dual tax advantage account. I then in my student loans filled in that slot there, and pulling that out, then it's to a Roth IRA. And with my income now, very fortunate that doing the backdoor Roth IRA option, and then it's back to the 401k and maxing out the 401k. And so those are pretty much all your tax advantage accounts. And if someone's gotten to that point and they're still able to invest money, which I'm fortunate to be able to do it now, is there's a lot less. It's pretty. I think if you look online, there's a lot of people who say, yeah, those are probably your top 5 categories and lists to go through in different orders, right? Depending on each person, and especially if you have student loans and you're doing PSLF, it's going to be completely different, right? You might prioritize your 401k first because you want to reduce your adjusted gross income. But once you've hit all those tax managed accounts, that's why I did the none to one program with the YFP real estate with David and Nate, because I was thinking, okay, well, let's look into real estate. Since that didn't pan out currently, and it probably will in the future, I just put the rest into a taxable brokerage account in the same low cost broad based index fund. So keeping it simple once again.
So Riley, address for me a common objection which people have is, hey, I want to retire early. Don't know exactly when that would be, but let's say, I don't know, late 40s, early 50s, kind of a moderate to aggressive timeline versus a traditional retirement age. And I've got all these assets tied up in retirement accounts where I'm going to take on a penalty if I take it out before the age of 59 and a half. So, insert brokerage account is one way to mitigate that. You astutely mentioned that you're, obviously optimizing your tax, accounts before you get to that point. But how have you thought through or reconciled what you may need from a point of retirement, which is unknown until you get to that age where you can draw from those accounts, and how you might mitigate some of that risk?
Yeah, I think of them in as 3 different categories: your pre-tax, your post-tax, and then your taxable brokerage accounts. And I think I'm sure there's an ideal percentage where if you're going to retire at age 45, for example, you want to have a good amount in your taxable brokerage account, right? Because you can't get to your tax advantage accounts earlier on. But there's, for example, currently a Roth IRA conversion ladder is one process that people take in place, and they're able to do that. And so I think a simple strategy is, make sure that all of those buckets have some money in there. So then you have the flexibility to, do whatever you want to do, whatever makes sense to you at the time. And so I will, in that time, luckily, since I've been able to, I started the Roth IRA early on. I think that's the one that people are going to have less on in life. But since I had that, at age 18, by the time I'm at a point where I want to scale back, I'll have enough in the 3 buckets. And I've learned enough about the different strategies in place that, I'll figure it out when the time comes. Is kind of my philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. One thing you mentioned, Riley, as we wrap up here, is I think you mentioned during your residency year, you were out learning about fire. You're on various websites. There's some great resources out there, blogs, podcasts, books. Anything you'd recommend to our listeners that you found to be especially helpful and insightful in your fire journey, at least on the beginning as you were learning more about this topic?
Yeah, I quickly moved from, I think the most resources out there are going to be in the blog space. And so if you look up different blogs, there's probably plenty of them. The first one I would recommend is called The Mad Fientist. That's where you get into the numbers of it. Of course, Mr. Money Mustache is probably the next one that people are going to find. He's probably the most well-known. And if anyone's going to find fire first, they're probably going to find him. And then for podcasts, the first 100 episodes of podcast called Choose FI, one of the co-hosts there was a pharmacist. It might be a little bit outdated now since those first 100 episodes are pretty old. Other podcasts I like listening to, Earn and Invest is called Doc G, Afford Anything by Paula Pant. And then books wise, there's some great ones out there, some classics like Your Money in Your Life, which is great because it's, learning about the concept of you're trading your life hours to make money, and then you're spending that money to get more of your life hours back.
Yeah.
We touched a little bit on Die with Zero. I'd definitely be promoting that one. That's for folks that are maybe learning to, like myself, to maybe spend a little bit more and enjoy more of life today. And then if you want to have a stress-free confidence in index funds, Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins is a great book as well.
Great stuff. Library of information there you recommended. We will link all of those in the show notes. So for folks that are listening, trying to write that down, don't worry, go to the show notes. We'll link those out. Great recommendations. Riley, really appreciate your time, your insights, your perspective. I love your intentionality around this topic. I love your financial IQ, and I appreciate you sharing your journey, especially on the front end of this, and look forward to seeing and tracking along the way.
Yeah, thank you. This was an absolute blast. I love talking about this topic. So thanks for having me.
As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.